Welcome to the South Bay Midweek Prayer and Bible Study. I know you're going to enjoy today's presentation. The live session is even better because we pray together at the beginning. Feel free to join us Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. You can find the link on our website. Now sit back and enjoy some spiritual refreshment.
Well, good to be with you. And yes, here's our last presentation on this. I know I've thrown a lot of material at you. I apologize, but you're my guinea pigs. I've actually presented part of this many times, but some of the most recent research is new. So I don't have time to time this out and figure out what's appropriate in 30 minutes. So I just throw it all at you. When we end, and and then I know not to try as much next time. We may have a few more minutes tonight, I understand. So why don't we go ahead and dive into this? So part 4, a little review as we begin. You're very familiar now with the quotation from Education, page 178, that talks about God has a timeline, the history which the great I Am has marked out in his word, uniting link after link in the prophetic chain from eternity in the past to eternity in the future, tells us where we are in the procession of the ages and what may be expected in the time to come. All that prophecy has foretold is coming to pass until the present time has been traced upon the pages of history, and we may be assured that all which is yet to come will be fulfilled in its order. We serve a wonderful God that would give us a map like this. He's not the watchmaker God that's wound up the earth and just set us out there on our own. He's a God who's intimately involved with the affairs of mankind, and be very interesting in heaven to really study this from a heavenly perspective, the play and interplay. He doesn't, you see there in Daniel where Michael is fighting against the king, this earthly king. There's a lot behind the scenes that we're not even aware of. But coming back to the prophetic timeline, this is the typical timeline, Daniel 2, Daniel 7 and 8 that we look at: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, and then papal Rome, the papacy. We come down to 1798 with the deadly wound when the Pope is taken captive by the French. And then the next thing on timeline is 1844. And then we jump to those last day events, the United States, image of the beast, latter rain, the mark of the beast, the plagues, Jesus' glorious return. But what we've been zeroing in on these last several weeks is what's to happen between 1798 and, the last day events that are all kind of clustered there around the end. What is to happen during that time? And what we've proposed is that's the period where the beast from the bottomless pit is ruling. Now, the U.S. comes up, late 1700s as well. Is the prophecy depicting kind of a parallel development of both these powers? Possibly. I think others, as I said, need to do more work on this. Or is the beast from the bottomless pit the prevailing power? That's what I think it is. When I look at Revelation 13 with the land beast as the U.S. is represented there, it says, he has 2 horns like a lamb and speaks like a dragon. I see that as that's when he takes his role, his prophetic role. Greece was a city-state, existed, had kings, was conquering before it stepped on the stage and became the Greece of Daniel 7 or Daniel 2 or Daniel 8. Same thing with Rome. So there's always a developmental phase of these nations until they get their world power. So anyway, nevertheless, I think that the point is that this beast from the bottomless pit has significant influence in the last days, that it would make the prophetic Hall of Fame. I mean, if it was only dealing with the few years of the French Revolution, why would God put it there? There were a lot of countries being overthrown in Europe in the late 1800s and the early 1800s. There was a lot of play and interplay. It had to have more significance than just those few years of the French Revolution. So you've heard my thesis the last several weeks. What I want to talk about now is how do we get from this secular humanist neo-Marxist state that I've demonstrated. And if anybody's watching the news and all, that's where we are, not only in America, but certainly in Europe and around the world. How do we move from that state to the Revelation 13, where the U.S. makes an image to the beast, where we get to a church state? What's that transition going to look like? Well, the short answer is, I don't know. and you don't know either. But we should consider different models, different scenarios, and not be too dogmatic about it, because you really don't know how prophecy is going to be fulfilled until it's fulfilled and it's fulfilling. And then you go, oh, that's what was being talked about there. So we can't be too dogmatic. So with that kind of disclaimer, let's look at a couple models to consider that I've considered. You'll probably come up with more models. The first one I call the religious right model of the 70s and the 90s through the 90s. This is the model that you're probably most familiar with. It's the one I kind of grew up in Adventism with. I was baptized in 1979. This is the model I preached in my pulpit, preached in evangelistic meetings. So let me just go through this model with you. So the religious right formed in the late 70s. You can trace it back a little bit before that, but basically late 70s, in response to the secularization taking place in the United States. Concerns were the immoral sexual revolution in the 60s, abortion on demand with Roe v. Wade in 73, Supreme Court removing prayer and Bible reading from schools, and later the burgeoning gay rights movement. So in 1979, Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority. It targeted the Republican Party to infiltrate it and to use it, and sought to elect politicians who would defend traditional Judeo-Christian values. So while the movement began as a Protestant movement, they were successful in forging an alliance with Catholicism over their shared opposition to abortion and other concerns. So evangelical leaders and Catholic scholars signed a joint statement called Evangelicals and Catholics Together in 1994. Chuck Colson, Protestant, Richard John Newhouse, who was a Catholic priest, converted from Protestantism, were the primary persons representing the two groups. And John MacArthur, who did not agree with this statement, that joint statement of working together, so states this in his analysis of the Evangelicals and Catholics Together. He says, the original purpose of the meetings was to discuss tensions in Latin America between Protestant missionaries and Catholic officials. In some countries, the Catholic Church was using political power to suppress Protestant evangelistic efforts. Protestant missionaries were being persecuted for their faith, Colson said. Colson continues, on the other side, some evangelicals were promoting the gospel by calling the Catholic Church the whore of Babylon, the Pope, the Antichrist, and the like. You wonder if we weren't considered by Chuck Colson as some of these Protestants saying these things. So this was bothering the Catholics, understandably, and the evangelicals were wanting to get the Catholics online, and so they had this ecumenical meeting. Not all evangelicals supported Evangelicals and Catholics Together, and that was often missed by Adventists during the 70s through the 90s. We kind of lumped all evangelical Protestants together, but not everybody agreed with it. People like John Ankerberg, D. James Kennedy, John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul said it was, quote, a step in exactly the wrong direction to say that there was theological agreement between Protestants and Catholics. MacArthur said the statement in effect of Catholics and evangelicals together, the statement in effect reverses what the Protestant Reformation advocated regarding sola scriptura and sola fide. The position of the reformers regarding justification, which was quite biblical, was pronounced as anathema by the Roman Catholic Council of Trent in 1547. Other essential biblical doctrines have been denied by Roman Catholic pronouncements, even recent ones. Unity with Roman Catholicism is not a worthy goal if it means sacrificing the truth. And I think all Protestants and Adventists would say amen to that. So there were key, very prominent evangelical Protestant preachers and leaders who stood up against this ecumenical movement to join Protestantism with Catholicism. That will become more important as we go on here. So the divergence within evangelical Christianity is important to understand and appreciate because it becomes a factor later in our discussion. Also happening in this era, Pope John Paul II released Unum Sint, All May Be One. It was a ecumenical document, the gift of salvation by evangelical and Catholic leaders, another ecumenical, a joint statement between Lutherans and Catholics, a very historic one, joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, where Lutherans basically surrendered everything Luther fought for. Combined, these events were seen by Adventists as a major step in the fulfillment of the image to the beast prophecies, and they definitely shaped our understanding of how we felt Revelation 13 would be fulfilled. So in the milieu of all this stuff happening, we felt this has to be the way this is all going to come about. Someone could do a nice doctoral thesis and go back and really kind of put together, where did we come up with this whole view that people like Lou Walton and others were all teaching at that time? Where did that originate? How did that all develop? I think it would be very interesting because it definitely has a genesis and definitely was influenced by things happening in that period of time. So, but now here we are 30 years later, let's just step back and evaluate the premises of that view, a view again that I taught and I preach. I have to step back and evaluate, okay, how right was I in this? Well, the religious right, which I abbreviate here, and all their ilk were influential in the elections of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and most recently Donald Trump. While the Bushes and Trump did support some of their initiatives, they were never successful in turning the liberal anti-Christian tide in America. I think that's pretty empirical. Neo-Marxism has continued to grow in power and influence. Some of the federal judges, this used to just frustrate me. I'd see these Republicans and conservatives and evangelicals and everybody working together and trying to stem off this far, far left liberal tide. And no matter what they do, they still got washed out to sea. They just could not win for anything, even when they got their presidents in. And you see that in point when you look at the federal judges they appointed. You have David Souter ended up having a very lengthy liberal record, as reported by USA Today. John Paul Stevens, appointed by Gerald Ford. John Roberts Jr. by G.W. Bush. These guys voted different ways, and a lot of them voted liberal on major cases. So the overall trend in America and the world is the liberal left, and it's becoming more radically left very quickly. So the religious right did not ascend and gain all this power to be able to just rule and put a Sunday law into place. That's what we were preaching. That is what we preach. And it has not happened. In fact, the trend has actually shifted the other direction. Another thing, impediments to a wholesale religious right resurgence, mainstream media, the courts, universities, labor unions, public sentiment, all tilt left, all tilt neo-Marxist. So there's an immense amount of power, wealth, and influence on the side of the Marxist left. And they're very hard to beat because of the clout that they have. Way more clout than the conservatives, especially Christian conservatives. So that's not to say that there isn't a future role for conservative Christians who, are far right. It's just acknowledging the current situation and what the conservatives must overcome if they are to play a role in controlling the government, because they don't have the power. They do not have the power. You got one conservative mainstream news media, and then everything else is left and ignoring stuff. And I don't mean to be political, and I'm not. I think you just sit back and look at this, and that's what you've got. That's what you've got going there. So it's very, very hard for conservatives to do anything. So evaluation of Adventist predictions regarding the religious right. Adventists were largely incorrect in reading the trend, and understandably so, because of what I said was happening there during the 70s and the 80s. But when you dig into this, we oppose those who were trying to stem the tide of the liberal left and their anti-God, anti-Christian agenda. We preached against them. We came out against them. When we moved, and I used to work for Amazing Facts. When we moved Amazing Facts from Maryland to California, there was a guy who helped us. He was a realtor in California who helped us on our relocation. He had recently led out in James Dobson's relocation from California to Colorado. And I was visiting with him one day, and he related a story an experience he'd had with Dobson, where Dobson, it's too long to probably tell you all of it, but we came out strong against Dobson in Liberty magazine in that time period. And we published an article by a non-Adventist that just really hit Dobson, that he's against religious liberty and he'd like nothing better and get control of the government and force his brand of religion on everybody. And of course, Adventists were all thinking Sunday law. So Dobson asked this Adventist realtor and said, "Why are you Adventists so much against me?" And we were. He came up in Dwight Nelson's net, what was that, net 98? And I mean, he was being quoted all the time by Adventists. And so this Adventist realtor explained to Dobson the whole mark of the beast issue. And Dobson let out a big sigh and said, "That's what it is?" And he said, I mean, you just take it for what it's worth. He said, "I would never do that. I would never force somebody to believe the way I believe." And he related that he grew up in a very conservative Christian background. He knew what it was like to be the person that didn't dance at the prom and was the odd guy out. My point is, none of us know what we would do in a situation. That's not my point. My point is, we attack these people, and from their perspective, they were trying to save us from the garbage that we've inherited today, where transgenderism is being taught to our kids, and everybody's just really, really messed up in this world. If you're keeping up with it, it's just a big, huge mess. And the Christian now is the persecuted person. That's the very thing they were fighting against. And yet here we were as Adventists attacking them and telling, and like, you're the enemy, because if you get in control, you're going to make the Sunday law. And here's my proposal to you as we evaluate this. I think we didn't know where we lived on the timeline. We were projecting ourselves into the future with the Sunday laws, and we were fighting that battle when we're actually back here, according to the prophecy, needing to fight neo-Marxism. And if we'd understood where we were on the timeline, we would address this thing completely differently. And if I have time, I'm going to take you to some very, very interesting Ellen White quotes that I think substantiate that premise that I've just shared there. So today's society is antagonistic to Christian values. The concerns of the religious right were correct. They were valid. It's risky today, if not dangerous, for a Christian to live in a leftist-held country in any time. Their religious speech rights are restricted. They get sued for not going along with the gay rights movement, meaning hiring gays, serving gay weddings, making cakes, whatever, forced to do things against their values, like abortions in Christian hospitals. It's dangerous to be a Christian in today's world. And depending on your country, it can be more dangerous than others. We just had a case just a few years ago. Canada came out with a gay rights law. I won't delve into the details of that, but it had major implications on our schools, our Adventist schools. And our schools crumbled. They went along with it. So, it's getting more and more difficult to maintain your views. Now, so that's my quick analysis of the religious right movement. We could spend a lot more. We could debate different sides of that, but I think we ought to be able to agree it fell way far short of its predictions for that time. We've had 30 years to test it. And that's being generous. We're 2021. This thing goes back to, let's say, 1980. So we've had 30, 40 years to test this thing, and it's not delivered what it promised. And the people who are pushing it, Pat Robertson and Falwell, they're all off the scene. So it's not delivered. What if we had considered the other model? What if we preached Revelation 11 more predominantly? What if we had predicted the growth of neo-Marxism? Would we have been correct? If we had taken the prophecy and predicted that, would we have been correct? I think we would have been correct. I think the history of the last 40 years shows that we would have been correct. And would that have helped us gain credibility? I think it would have. So let's look at that model. It's model 2. The beast from the bottomless pit obtains global political dominance, influencing laws, public sentiment, thereby creating societies that are hostile to Christians. So freedom and acceptance of divergent opinions is allowed for everyone but those who hold conservative Christian values. Consequently, Christians are marginalized. And when you look at it, you go, why in the world would today, and we've especially seen this in the last year, why would all these young people be so committed to Marxism? It's counterintuitive, because Marxist governments do not have a long, successful track record before they implode. And they have to use military and police force to maintain control over the government and people. People suffer under Marxist governments. Hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people actually, have died at the hands of Marxist governments. You know, right now there is an attack on America, the whole 1619 project and all. These are not the musings of far-right conspiracists. This is all factual stuff that's being debated in the public square. The 1619 project is bogus. It's completely bogus, but it's driving what history is being taught to kids. And so it's neo-Marxist. It really comes right out of Marxism. So what Marxism has to do to take over is they have to rewrite your history. And if you listen to some of these books I suggested last week, you'll see that is their model. They rewrite your history. So now you think of America as an oppressive place. It was never fair. It was never a good place. And so they rewrite the history. So you hate America, and then they use that momentum to get you to change America. But what is it going to change into? It's going to change into the very thing they accuse America being originally. So Marxist governments caused society to crumble. In the French Revolution, life became so difficult that the revolutionary government was overthrown. And Napoleon, who was a friend of the revolution, takes power and becomes a dictator. And this is some very interesting stuff I want to share with you here, that I'm not saying exactly what happened in the French Revolution will repeat itself here in the end, because we don't know. But this type of thing happens, and you can find it in other revolutions as well. So Napoleon was down in Egypt. He failed there, but he was a propagandist. He was a great marketer. He sent these marketing pieces back to France all the time, and it made him a hero in the public's eye. When everything was in chaos during the French Revolution and no one knew who was going to be on the guillotine next, they could read in the newspaper about this brilliant general Napoleon and his exploits down in Italy or Egypt, depending on what era we're talking about. So he comes back to France, 1798-99, to a hero's welcome. And he puts together an alliance with certain individuals that I named here on the screen. Long story short, he's able to overturn the revolution, the power base in the revolution, and they adopt a new constitution. They form a council of 5 or 3, I forget what it was. There were 2 times they did this, as I understand it. And ultimately, he comes out on top. He comes out on top as the dictator. So you have the Constitution of the year 8. The year 8, they recounted the years. And so the power shifts to Napoleon, and Napoleon now becomes a dictator. And it's the very thing that they ousted the king for being a dictator. And here they fought so hard to get all these liberties, but because they took this approach against God and they didn't build their new republic on godly principles like we did in America, they were anti-God. It just all imploded. It was very violent, very dangerous. And so now they needed some stability. And so Napoleon comes into that vacuum, and they go, bring us stability, and they give up a lot of their freedoms for this dictator who drags them into many, many years of war. So the model, the second model here is, what if that's what's intended here in the end, that you're going to have this shift from the left to the right. The power shifts from the old neo-Marxist kingdom to a neo-Christian image of the beast. And in that context, the mark of the beast is passed. So people are forced by economics or death to conform to the laws of the state, the mark of the beast. And then you get the latter rain, loud cry, and so forth, and the second coming. What if that's what's intended there? I think you actually could chart several paths out of neo-Marxism, out of beast from the bottomless pit to a Sunday law. That would just be one. That's what we call the pendulum shift. And that view is actually becoming more and more popular and talked about. In the early 90s, I based on my study of the superior prophecy in Revelation 11, based on my studies at that time. So we're talking 30 years ago. And I came to the conclusion that things would get much worse for Christianity, that the moral majority, the religious right, and all them were not the greatest threats to our religious liberty. I told people I was more concerned about the left than I was the right based on the prophecy and what I was seeing. And also I laid out a model based on Ellen and James White's practice of how to work with conservative Christians who were trying to protect our nation from the threat of the emerging neo-Marxism. I began preaching on that topic at camp meetings and churches. Phil had me speak once at Three Angels Church in Wichita. I think I presented this there at that time. I published a study paper called Legislating Morality in 1992 that laid out a case for being defenders of morality in the public square. Because back then, the big thing in Adventism was you can't legislate morality. And I countered that through Bible study and Ellen White. All laws are going to legislate morality. It just depends on whose morality you're going to legislate. It comes down. The law is going to have some moral basis. It's either going to be immoral or godly moral, but it depends on whose morality you're going to legislate. So I discussed that in this article. It was published in Ministry Magazine as an op-ed 6 years later in 1998. So I just say this to say that that I was talking about this back then. I was probably one of the lone persons doing it, but I think this has turned out to be the case. Here's from the Ministry Magazine article I just cited. But if Christians do not stand for moral beliefs and values, who will? Who will resist the incessant tide of immorality that seeks to erode society? If we absent ourselves from the public forum, what type of society will we inherit after those with purely secularized concerns exercise their right to vote and influence public opinion? Here's what happens when Christians are silent. Secular humanists control the state. With no fear of God, there's no fear of degradation and self-destruction. Laws are enacted that are godless and sustain corruption. How will Christians fare in such a society? They'll not be able to freely live out their faith, and their children will be constantly bombarded with ungodliness and emptiness. Ellen White was no silent observer when it came to the moral issues that affect society. One can only wonder what she would tell Adventists today regarding abortion upon demand, pornography, euthanasia. We could add transgenderism and on in 30 years later. Surely she would not condemn those in our nation who champion reform and laws that she said, quote, rigidly enforce common sense virtues. So she said that we should help pass laws that rigidly enforce morality. I'll come to that quote in a moment. So I went to find this quote, this article. I'd forgotten the date. It was published in Ministry Magazine. And when I pulled it up in their archives, someone commented 5 months ago on that article. And they said, great article. Today we can see the consequences of our silence regarding all evils in the society. So the very point that I'm making here, somebody caught 5 months ago and said, you were spot on then. And we should have been talking about this back then. And now we see that we missed our opportunity. So what I propose is that this model has been authenticated, the second model, over the past 20, 30 years. The religious right has become a toothless tiger, where it really counts in the political process and shaping society, while the neo-Marxists from the bottomless pit have been winning the war against the Bible and its truths. So where does it go from here? What can we expect? I'm going to share with you a couple scenarios. First possible scenario to consider. And again, you'll come up with maybe some other stuff. You'll go, nah, it could never be that. And that's fine. That's all fair. None of us know where it goes. We're just trying to make sense of it. but humor me here as I share a couple scenarios. So the first one is a reaction against the neo-Marxist state. The pendulum of influence and power swings from left to right. I mentioned it before. So conservative Christians with an agenda for Sunday laws are somehow able to organize themselves and outmaneuver the left to win the halls of power. Once conservative Christians are in power, they pass legislation to force their brand of Christianity on the country, sort of a Talibanization of America. You heard it here first, that term, a Talibanization of America. Yeah, you see that's what's happening right now in Afghanistan. The Taliban takes over the Constitution, and they're conservative. They're going to make all Muslims dress a certain way, act a certain way, and try to get them to think a certain way. So we Talibanize America through the conservative Christians. Crises that are happening shape public opinion and policy to limit freedom of speech and religion. So they use the crises to silence opposition. And we see that's what's happened during the pandemic. There is no room in America to think differently than those in power. You are silenced, you're canceled. This whole cancel culture is a very, very dangerous thing to have. So they're silenced. So we see this in the future. And then you layer on top of that, or mix into the recipe, the miracle working power of Satan. And this is the secret sauce in whatever scenario going forward. This is the game changer, because you can think it's going to happen a certain way or can't happen a certain way. But as soon as you have Satan impersonating Jesus walking down the street, everybody becomes a believer. Everybody's just going to go, what do you have to say? We'll do it. So this lends credibility, garners support for the conservative backlash. All right. Now you need to consider a disclaimer, how plausible certain parts of this scenario may be. It's a tall order to overcome the deeply entrenched neo-Marxism in the media and power base. Satan walking down the street could make that happen, but I think that's what it would take. Trump ran as a conservative. He was able to win his first term, but he was opposed even by his own party for the first 2 years. And then he was hunted and hounded by the left for his entire first term. So even if you get and I call him a neo-conservative, he's not really, but you get him, and he's a populist, and the conservatives came behind him, but he wasn't even able to pull it off. And his own party opposed him. A true conservative might find populist support, but the power base will prevent him from controlling. I wish I had time to talk to you about how I think God allows certain powers come into being to kind of test the market, and you can see, all right, this doesn't work. So neo-Marxists continue to gain more control. They're able to implement their policies. Boy, I made this really small. I should have gone back and edited this. These policies repudiate the principles of the Constitution. So here you just have basically the Sunday laws coming in, okay? And then the system collapses under its own weight, leading to social chaos. I think this should have been edited out. Give me just a second here. Yeah, this is the second scenario. All right, so that's the first scenario, the religious right scenario. This is the second scenario. So the neo-Marxists that are in control continue. And basically, you see the dissolution of society. It collapses under its own weight. We go the way of Venezuela. We go the way of, it all just falls apart. And in that chaos, then we see what I mentioned happened earlier during the French Revolution. There's so much chaos. People just say, bring back some order. Our dollar's worth nothing. Look, if you look right now, it's hard to get products. We're like in a third world country. I bought a desk. It took me 5 months to get the desk. This is like third world country. And you go and they go, well, we can't get that. You can't buy that anymore. We're building a new conference office building. Prices went up 33%. For what reason? Cargo ships can't even get into America. They're sitting by the hundreds off the coast, probably around 100 or so. So it's changed. It's changed. So eventually, the weight of all that, the debt that's being piled on the future generation that Republicans and Democrats are piling on us, it can't sustain itself. So it falls apart. And when it falls apart and the country falls apart, and you've got 10 times what we just saw the last year with defunding the police, and you just got total chaos. What are you going to have? Somebody's got to bring some normalcy. People want to find this equilibrium, the stasis. So they got to get to that point. And in walks Napoleon, if you will. In walks Napoleon and solves it. Is that the Pope? Is that somebody that makes an alliance with the Pope? We don't know, but that's kind of the scenario. So we go into more chaos. So we don't need the religious right to win the halls of power. We just need the left to totally implode. And if it implodes, then people are going to be susceptible to whoever who comes in just to get the power. And by the way, it's all about power. Don't miss the point that, in fact, I've got it here in a slide. So national, international crises can also be the precipitating crisis. These are other scenarios that get people to look for an alternative solution. Case in point, the COVID-19 pandemic and race riots of 2020, total game changers for society and politics. Game changers of who's elected, everything. It all happened very quickly with very little opposition. So we could build a case that would involve a return to God and the Sunday law through some of these other scenarios. Another thing to consider, follow the money. The people who get in power have a lust for power and riches. They're sociopathic and they're narcissistic. And that's what drives them. They want the power. They want the riches. You follow any of these people, it's what it's about. I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican. So I believe it's that lust for power more so than an ideology that they think is superior and that will make the world a better place. And so you have this term that was ascribed to Lenin or Stalin, and it really wasn't them. And I don't have time to get into who coined it, but the useful innocents. We often call it the useful idiots, but the correct translation was useful innocents. So you manipulate the people who will just believe what you tell them and then use their influence and power, getting them rioting in the streets and voting at the polls to get you into power. And it's all manipulated, and you can actually read their playbooks. Get Saul Alinsky's book. Saul Alinsky, his name became well known during Obama's first run for the presidency. Rules for Radicals. Saul Alinsky didn't want to solve anything. He just wanted to use the frustration of people to create revolution. So this is the other option. Revelation 18 talks about a lust for wealth and power. You can read that in Revelation 18. Why would God make a big point of spending many verses pointing out the merchants of the earth and the beast power and them, all about their luxuries and their desire for wealth and power, if it isn't a point in one way or another? So the making of a dictator. Napoleon stepped into the chaotic, dangerous scene that France had become, to include everyone, even the revolutionary. Robespierre, the leading revolutionary, died on the guillotine himself in 1794. People long for stability. They need a strong leader to bring this stability, one who's not against the principles of the revolution, but will make it a safer place. Napoleon saw himself as that man, was able to sell people on that, and he became the emperor in 1804. I want to show you something really interesting here. I've got a few more minutes. Napoleon, these are quotes from the source that you see on the screen. Napoleon was seen as a star in the dark sky. He had victory over many wars, and when they set up the directory and they started changing things to try to find some stability, they looked who could help us, and it was Napoleon. He was the star. So they set up this directory legislature, and they forced they hand the government over to Napoleon by 1799. All right, and then November 9, 1799. That's the end of the French Revolution, because Napoleon becomes the emperor. He ends the French Revolution. It leads to Bonaparte's dictatorship, and in 1804. He claims himself that he is an emperor. On May 18, 1804, that's the famous scene from this painting where the Pope is invited to come to Notre Dame, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, on December 2. It's coronation ceremony. The Pope's supposed to put the crown on Napoleon's head. Napoleon tells him, no, 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 you'll not be putting the crown on my head. I'll be putting the crown on my own head, because he who puts the crown is conferring power. And he says, I don't get my power from the church. But he wanted the Pope there. So it's very interesting, this church and state relationship that he has, but he's telling everybody, I'm the state, I'm much more powerful than the church. And he demeans the Pope. Now, future doesn't have to mirror this history, as I said, but it can be instructive. So how should we live today? How can we synchronize our lives to the prophetic timeline if you see light in this? I'm going to jump through a couple of things. Read Prophets and Kings in this section, 499, 500 through there. That's Ellen White's take on Daniel 2, much deeper than what we present on Daniel 2, much deeper. And here's one thing that's very interesting in there. In his law, God has made known the principles that underlie all true prosperity, both of nations and of individuals. The blessings thus assured to Israel are on the same conditions and in the same degree assured to every nation under the broad heavens. Now, we typically take that type of philosophy and we say, if you follow God and you follow his law, you will be blessed. If you don't, it not go well for you. Ellen White extends it. She says that same principle applies to nations. So, continuing the quote, the Medo-Persian realm was visited by the wrath of heaven because in it, God's law had been trampled underfoot. So why did Medo-Persia fall to Greece? Because they trampled God's law underfoot. To understand that righteousness exalts a nation, that the throne is established by righteousness and upheld by mercy, to recognize the outworking of these principles in the manifestation of his power, who removes kings and sets up kings, this is to understand the philosophy of history. It's not just that God says, all right, Medo-Persia, you're done, time for Greece. It's not that. There's a reason Medo-Persia was done. There's a reason Greece was done. It was because they were trampling God's law and his principles underfoot, and it was time for judgment. So the same standard of measurement that God gave to Israel when they trampled his law underfoot, then judgment came. Babylon conquered them. That same standard was used for the Gentile kings. Just think about Jonah and the implications of that principle. So God sends the prophet Jonah. When they repent, God relents. The strength of nations is measured by the fidelity with which they fulfill God's purpose. So you go back and read that, and you'll see that it's all about being faithful to God. And so when a nation becomes neo-Marxist and anti-God, it's not long before we fall. Ellen White was concerned with the United States in her day and the influences that were undermining society. And so it was out of that she was a social reformer. In selected areas, the areas that mattered in her day, temperance, health and diet, dress, she was a social reformer because she saw society having laws that sustained immoral influences on people, and it would degrade people, and therefore they would not be as susceptible to the gospel. And so she sought through the political realm to change those laws. Other Christian groups shared these concerns, and James and Ellen White both united with them. Let me share with you a couple of quick quotes here. There is a cause for the moral paralysis upon society. Drink in the words that she's saying here. There's a lot to this. Is our society today morally paralyzed? There is. There's a cause for it. What's the cause? Our laws sustain an evil which is sapping their very foundations. Many deplore the wrongs which they know exist, but consider themselves free from all responsibility in the matter. This cannot be. Every individual exerts an influence in society. In our favored land, every voter has some voice in determining what laws shall control the nation. Should not that influence and vote be cast on the side of temperance and virtue? The advocates of temperance fail to do their whole duty unless they exert their influence by precept and example, by voice, pen, and vote in favor of prohibition and total abstinence. Let laws be enacted and rigidly enforced. That's where I picked up those two word phrases earlier. Prohibiting the sale and use of ardent spirits as a beverage. Ellen White advocated that our pastors get in the pulpit, use voice, pen, and vote, and urge our people to go to the polls and vote for candidates, not just the issue, but for candidates that would support temperance. Battle Creek ran their own Adventist mayoral candidate on a temperance issue. And to vote for this, to pass a law to restrict other people's freedom to drink what they wanted to drink. Because if people were drinking, buying and selling and using liquor, then it would undermine the foundations of society. Now, how much more have all these other issues undermined foundations of society since? Give you something to think about there. These I'm just going to breeze through without quoting them. Ellen White invited the Women's Christian Temperance Union to camp meetings to speak, and she advocated that we should be doing that. She says right here, the workers of the WCTU are far in advance of our leaders. She says there were precious souls in that organization. If we will unite with them where we could, she didn't always tell them to unite, but she said where we could, then we could have an influence on them and help them learn the truth. So in other words, don't go against the Dobsons. Don't go against these guys that are fighting for morality. Know where you live on the timeline. Work with them, have a positive influence on them. A.T. Jones, he set the model for our religious liberty work. It was an antagonistic model to fight against conservative Christians. He put his stamp on our religious liberty work. You can see it in religious liberty work, especially through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Ellen White rebuked A.T. Jones, rebuked him and said his articles attacking the WCTU were like Pharisees and that you would never win any of those souls. You know what Jones was exercised about? The WCTU was advocating for Sunday laws so that they could close the saloons at least on Sundays. And he said, oh, here comes the mark of the beast. And here we're so tied at the hip with the WCTU, we need to get out of there because they're going to have the mark of the beast. Ellen White said, you need to stop saying things like that. She wrote him a few weeks later, and she said, not only should we not get out of there, some of our best talent should be set to work for the WCTU. And she says, you're not, my brother, you do not represent truth in the situation of things as so formidable that those belonging to the WCTU will turn away from us in despair. So there's a whole model there if you study it, and I outline it in my book, my article, Legislating Morality, and as a way to work. I think there's still room to learn from this and to work with her, work with God on this. The principle I'm working off of is we should never make a whole doctrine off of one text. You need other texts to give, the coordinates. A GPS works off of 3 coordinates. You need other texts to substantiate something. Are there other texts that do this? Let me share a few with you here. And you're seeing my screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So Revelation 13, 11 through 17. Is this, there's a couple things here. I think these are some of the things that I'm just pondering. Is a progression here. He had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And then he exercises all the authority of the first beast. The United States did not start off, it grew. It grew. We had religious laws, but then more liberty came in, more freedoms and balance. But this shows us now swinging like really far right, legislating worship. Could this be depicting a progression in the development of the U.S.? 2 horns like a lamb, it's young, it's innocent, but now it's going to grow to where it speaks like a dragon. Could that possibly also be indicating a shift to the left? Because the dragon is the symbol of Satan. It's not the symbol of the lamb. It's the symbol of Satan. Could that be inferred in that? I don't know, and I don't know that anybody could ever answer that definitively, but we've heard so much other stuff through the years, and I've not had time to go back through this and look at it more recently again, but is there a dragon phase to America that's implied here? Just something to think about. I'm not dogmatic on that. I think it needs more study. Look at the spirit of prophecy and all that. Revelation 16:13. you have the three powers under the sixth angel leading up to Armageddon. It's the Armageddon plague here. So the mouth of the dragon, the three unclean spirits come like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. So the beast is Catholicism. The false prophet is apostate Protestantism. So you got the whole world coming together for the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Well, who's left? You got all the Catholics. You got all the Protestants. The dragon has to encompass all your pagan religions and your atheists. They all have to come together to this. And I think the atheists are going to be won over just like that, because what an atheist wants is proof of supernatural beings. And Satan's going to give them that proof in spades. So they're going to convert right away. There'll be some of the first conversions. So the whole world is encompassed here in this. So that dragon, if the dragon is representing your non-Christian religions and your atheism, and there's Eckhart Mueller has done some work on equating the dragon with the beast from the bottomless pit. Could there be that association implied in here in Revelation 13:11? Again, something to study. I'm not putting that out there as, yeah, I'm solid on that, but it's got a question mark for me on that to look at it more. Daniel 11:40, I think, is one of those confirming prophecies. At the time of the end, the king of the south attacks him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and so on. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. There's different interpretations on this. The one that I favor is probably the one that a lot of conservative Adventists, historicist Adventists, I should say, look at this, that the time of the end is 1798. The king of south is Egypt. Geographically, according to Daniel, is Egypt. It's representing the French Revolution atheistic movement. It comes against the king of the north. So the king of the south attacks him, the king of the north. And so that's that. But then the prophecy says the king of the north is going to react and respond to the king of south and overwhelm him. And he's going to enter countries, overwhelm him, and pass through. So he's going to flood all the places. In fact, the language here is talking about flooding. All the places that the king of the south has dominated, the king of the north is going to come back and take it all back over. So this would support that pendulum swing model here. Revelation 17 is an interesting one, another very debated. I was surprised at how debated this prophecy is. I favor Louis Weir. If you're familiar with Louis Weir, his view of this makes the most sense to me. Most Bible commentaries, Adventists included, take Revelation 17 and they say John uses the present tense of is in Revelation 17, and therefore when he's referring to the head on the beast, the kingdom that was in power right then, he's referring to Rome. And that's because John uses the present tense. I don't know why we would interpret it that way. You let the text interpret itself as to the timing. John sees himself in heaven. Was it that mean that we should think that, something was very significant? He sees the redeemed in heaven in Revelation 15, singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. And he called it present tense. Well, we take that and we say that's a future prophecy. So I have a hard time understanding this because it doesn't line up with the rest of the outline prophecy. But let me share with you this. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So the harlot woman's in the wilderness. In Revelation 12, the pure woman is in the wilderness. Wilderness means a persecuted state when they're not in power. So in Revelation 17, the harlot woman, the papacy, is in the deadly wound phase. It's in the wilderness. And then you come to verses 7 and 8, where he says, the beast you saw was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit. So the beast, the papacy, was past tense. It is not at this time, present tense. And yet it is, it will be, as the NIV says, it will come. So the timing of Revelation 17, again, puts the beast in the deadly wound phase. The will be is when the wound is healed and the papacy regains power. In fact, if you look at It says there, people will marvel when they see the beast power revived. This is the same Greek word used in Revelation 13:3. When the deadly wound is healed, all the world wonders and follows after the beast. It's the same Greek word. So I believe this is what's being depicted here. And then you have the 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is. That's the 6th one. This is where they say this is pagan Rome. The other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. So when that 7th king, out of the 7 heads, the 7th king comes, he only lives for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not, which I'm saying is the papacy, is an 8th king. There weren't 8 kings, there weren't 8 heads. 8th represents resurrection. It's one of the 7 coming back to life. So the present kingdom, number 6, is coexistent with the woman in the wilderness, and the beast is not phased. Therefore, this is the prophetic kingdom that's in power during the deadly wound phase. When the is kingdom passes, the next power is on the scene for only a little while. Like says, the last movements will be rapid. This 7th kingdom leads to the return of one of the prior powers as an 8th king, even though there's not an 8th head. There's a typo there. 8 symbolizes resurrection. So it's a resurrection of one of the prior 7 kings. So I believe this is what pulls it together here of what I was saying earlier and confirms this whole Revelation 11 thing. So most of these Revelation 17 things that take the position that pagan Rome was the is phase, the 6th king, they have to start with Egypt and Assyria to get to Rome, pagan Rome, to be number 6. But Daniel never starts with Egypt and Assyria. He always starts with Babylon. And we could talk more about that. But if you take that premise, Babylon is the first one, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, papacy, number 5. Number 6 now is the missing beast of Bible prophecy. We never talk about it. It's a beast. It's a kingdom. Why don't we talk about it? It needs to be in the lineup. It's there. Egypt is mentioned only in context with the beast from the bottomless pit. Assyria is not mentioned at all in the prophetic lineup, and yet we're going to stick them as the first 2 when they're never mentioned in Revelation or Daniel in the outline prophecies. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So number 6 now becomes the beast that is not in anybody's lineup, and it should be, because it certainly is there in John's and Revelation 11. That's the is time, and that coincides with the woman's in the wilderness and is not, and yet comes back and is. So that's number 6. When it's overthrown, the beast from the bottomless pit is overthrown, then the United States comes and speaks like a dragon, if you're going to take the view that the dragon is the legislation of laws, religious laws, which is our traditional view, not the one I suggested earlier, but it's going to make an image to the beast. And it's only for a little while, because those last movements are going to be rapid when you have the mark of the beast come into power. And it's during that time that John links this one that was and is not comes back to life. And it's the 8th. That's the revival, the resurrection of the papacy power to global influence and their role in legislating Sunday laws. That, to me, confirms the whole thing of what we're talking about. You don't have to have that to see the influence of neo-Marxism, but this, I think, shows and suggests the path forward. Again, my caution is we don't know the future. Just keep these things in mind, live in the moment, respond faithfully to where you are on the prophetic timeline. But these are some interesting things to ponder.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found today's presentation to be a blessing to you. And it's never good to keep things to yourself. It's always best to share them. So find someone that you can share what you have been blessed with others. If you enjoyed today's presentation, let us know by hitting the like button, and subscribe to this channel if you want to know when there's new presentations coming out. God bless. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.